You're welcome back. Nigeria's spending plan for 2026 in focus. Now, the Senate has been meeting and a lot has been discussed about the spending plan for 2026. First of all, we expect to have a single budget by April. That's the promise of the President Bola Tinubu. Now, the Senate especially and the House of Representatives have been having their committees meet to discuss what to expect, how to streamline the spending. But there are some worries that have also come up in the midst of the 2026 spending, like the debt trap. Some people say it's a debt trap when we look at the deficit there. Some people say the revenue plan is not realistic. We've seen what's happening with oil prices. How many times does it meet with the target of Nigeria's budget, revenue projections? Overly optimistic. That's how they say. There's also the fiscal mismanagement claims that may deter or be a hurdle to the spending this year. And then there's the leakages also. That's also another worrying fiscal discipline or indiscipline. But let's explore some of this with an individual who has attended some of those committee meetings with the lawmakers. Mr. Tilewa Adebajo is the Chief Executive Officer of the CFG Advisory. Mr. Adebajo, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Eni. How are you?
Good. And last week, I believe, you were part of some of those House committee meetings on the appropriation bill. Share with us your experience, some conversations that you had with the lawmakers.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me extend my gratitude to the Senate President and the Deputy Senate President, and especially my chief host, Senator Solomon Olamelekun, the Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, for inviting me to the interactive session the Senate had last week, Monday, on the 2026 budget. There were several presentations. I was also made a presentation amongst with some of the Minister of State for Finance, the Auditor General, and we had a professor from UNILAG who gave us some overviews, and there were contributions from other ministries and other senators included. We had very frank deliberations, and I think it was very clear to what direction the budget was going. The Minister of State for Finance talked about the issue of creating an investment budget to be able to put aside some money every year to make capital investments. As you know, for the last 2 years, we've not been able to fund the capital budgets. My own presentation focused on 2 areas, which were my concerns on the budget. My first concern, which I addressed to the House Committee, to the Senate Committee on Appropriations, had to do with the fact that 5 key sectors of the Nigerian economy, defense, security, infrastructure, police, health and education and power, have a budget of about 15 trillion. Debt service alone has a budget of 15.9 trillion. So debt service eclipsed the budget of key areas, which I mentioned to them. I also mentioned to them that I was also concerned about the deficit of 25.9 trillion, which was exactly the size, about the same size of the total pension assets in Nigeria, which is a cause for concern. And the ability to be able to fund this deficit, an accumulative deficit over the last 3.5, 4 years of close to 50 trillion. So those were the concerns that I addressed to them. They've taken them into consideration. And I think the key argument, government is a continuum, but my key concern is the fact that we're budgeting with the revenues that we are not able to achieve.
Yeah, so that's also one of the concerns that has been discussed before now, that the revenue targets seem unrealistic. Did that come up in your conversations? What did the lawmakers say? Any plan to, make it more realistic?
Yes, I think we argued this extensively, and I think credit to the Senate committee. It was a whole non-holds-barred session. They made their points, as I said, that government is a continuum, and the fact that government needs to continue and they need to continue to pay the salaries for civil servants, policemen, and all, air traffic controllers. And yes, we understand that. But at the end of the day, government finances also needs to be in check. And I think what we now said is the fact that we now have to start taking a look at alternatives as to how they're going to meet their revenue shortfall. The privatization exercise which they budgeted for is only coming up with about 300 billion, which is less than 1% of the deficit. So what I suggested was the sell down of the JV assets, not sell off, but sell down of the JV assets to be able to raise close to about 30 to 40 billion dollars, that which can be used to not only plug the hole, but to pay down the debts and also make some investments in the sovereign wealth fund. So they said, okay, well, they'll call the NNPC GMD to the committee to tell them how much the NNPC can actually deliver by selling down some of the JV assets. But I think, yes, we had a frank discussion, and they're going to call all the other ministries that are generating revenue to see exactly what can be done. And I think they're also going to discuss with the Ministry of Finance Incorporated to see how they can also optimize some of those assets. So that was where we left the discussion on the revenue mobilization.
Yeah, so I've heard that perspective before, talking about maximizing the public asset. If you could elaborate on that. One of my guests some time ago had said that he doesn't think that we should have issues of debts and borrowings if only the government will look inwards to the assets available to it to generate revenue. I wonder if you could please share your thoughts on how that can be maximized.
Well, first of all, take a look at Lagos, for instance. Let us take a look at key federal assets in Lagos. You have the airport. You have the Federal Secretariat in Ikoyi, which has been abandoned for years. You have Tafa Balewa Square. You have a lot of other government properties and assets like the Trade Fair Complex. These are genuine assets that, if properly managed, can be generating significant revenues for government. But they're not well managed, and they're not properly managed, so they're not delivering the right income that we'd look at. The Ministry of Finance Incorporated is holding about 300 trillion worth of assets owned by the federal government of Nigeria. So the question now is that a lot of all these assets are probably underutilized, and some of them might just need to be concessioned. Not everything needs to be sold or privatized, but you need to concession them, you need to optimize them so that you can unlock value that can not only lead to the growth of the economy, but also the development of the economy. So these are the challenging issues we have with a lot of all these, not only assets, but also state-owned enterprises that are not delivering value. NNPC also is one of the state-owned assets that also can be optimized. Our refineries are not working properly. As you know, they're a drain on the economy, they're a drain on resources. Because if those refineries were working, then a lot of things will be happening properly. And if you cannot run those refineries, then concession them out. Even if you're not going to sell them, concession them to people who can deliver value on those assets, instead of us spending money on assets that are not yielding any tangible benefits. So all around the country, all around, it's a lot of things where Nigeria needs to get things done. We need to look inwards.
And there's also the concern of fiscal mismanagement, repeating structural and poor implementation patterns. I mean, over the years, we hardly have a 50% implementation of our budget, and there are fears that we just keep continuing in the same trend, which we see did not work the previous year.
Yes, and one of the things I did was to commit to the committee that I would like to work with them to upgrade the Fiscal Responsibility Act. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is an act that provides the financial circuit breakers to fiscal management in Nigeria. The Fiscal Responsibility Act also provides for a Fiscal Responsibility Commission which is supposed to have oversight for fiscal management in Nigeria. But unfortunately, that Fiscal Responsibility Commission has not been empowered. So what we also discussed in this session was we need to empower the Fiscal Responsibility Commission. And I committed to the committee that after they've passed this budget, I'd like to work with them for us to update the Fiscal Responsibility Act to make it in line with the current situation in the Nigerian fiscal space. Because we do have the laws in place for fiscal management, but sometimes we just don't follow the tenets of those laws. And I think this is what has got us to where we are. But there needs to be some monitoring. And if we have a Fiscal Responsibility Commission that is active, just like the Debt Management Office, then we will have some level of fiscal discipline.
So do you think that can quell the concerns on fiscal indiscipline, which is also has been attributed to the low percentage of budget implementation?
Yes, because if you have a Fiscal Responsibility Commission active, their own job is to be able to manage budget implementation. And if you know that your budget performance is below par, that means that there's a problem fundamentally with your budgeting methodology. And the key problem is that we keep making all these revenue projections. And that's why we have a 25 trillion deficit, which is similar to the level of pension funds, as I mentioned, at 27 trillion. Why are you having such a huge deficit, which is equivalent to the sum of the total savings in the country? So this is a big challenge. So what we need to tell ourselves is the fact that the revenues we have, we need to cut that coat according to our size. We can no longer continue to budget for revenues that we do not have or we do not make. Let us budget with the reality of our revenues. So let's take a look at our revenues from last year. What was the actual? So our budgeting should be based on our actual revenues from last year, not what we think that we can earn. And that is really why we've had the shortfall over the successive years.
But I think one thing that Nigerians can actually look forward to is the president's promise. We won't be having multiple budgets running concurrently. I believe he said from April. I hope we're on track for that.
Definitely, and I think the chairman of the Separate Appropriations Committee also confirmed that he has received that directive from the presidency that, going forward, once this budget is passed, everything must be consolidated into one single budget. I think that is pretty clear now.
All right, thank you so much for sharing your experience and conversations at the Senate Committee with us. The Chief Executive Officer of VCFG Advisory, Mr. Tilewa Adebajo.
Thank you very much.